Let me begin by thanking all of you for what you do. I know that, and I've shared this with many of you, people love to say, we want more schools, we want more roads, we want more community activity, but when they come to the business people in the country, we love to beat up on them. And very few people look and say thank you for what you do in terms of creating the jobs and helping to build those roads and all the things that we do. And so I want to make sure that I stop and just say thank you for everything you do. And I want to give you just an analogy which happens to be a favorite for the First Lady of Virginia, and I've shared it with some of you before, but I'd offer this to you this morning, and whenever I'm with her, she'll say, will you tell us about the Indiana governor? And one of my best friends is Mike Pence. Mike sits beside me in the Judiciary Committee, and we were talking one time about our wives and how we wouldn't be where we were without our wives and how much we appreciated what they did. And Mike then told me a story about a former governor in Indiana. This was years ago, and I can tell by the color of some of your hair that you will agree with me, and you'll remember back when they used to have not just the normal service centers, but they had filling stations where you'd pull in and people would actually come out and put gas in your car. And the governor was driving around in the state limousine, and they were driving down some dirt roads in Indiana. And he had the First Lady in the back seat with him, and all of a sudden the driver pulls into this filling station, and two attendants come out. One goes right to the back of the car and begins filling the car up with gas, and the other one's just standing by the pumps. And the First Lady looks, and she looks, and then all of a sudden she opens the door, jumps out of the state limousine, goes up to this guy standing by the pumps, puts her arms around him and kisses him on the cheek, and he looks at her, and they start smiling and talking and having this conversation. And after the guy in the back has finished filling up the state limousine, he kisses the First Lady on the cheek. She gets back in the car. Driver takes off. They're driving down the road, and the governor looks at her and says, "What was that all about?" And she looks and she says, "Oh, that was Bob. Bob was my first love in high school. You've never met Bob. I've never introduced you to Bob." And so they're driving down the road, and all of a sudden the governor did what some of us guys foolishly do sometimes to our wives. He gave the smirk, to his wife. And she said, "Well, what's that all about?" And he goes, "Nothing. She said, "Yeah, tell me, what was that all about?" And he finally looks and he says, "Well, I'm just thinking, you dated Bob and you dated me, and, Bob became a filling station attendant and I became the governor of Indiana. And I was just thinking, what would have happened if you'd have married Bob?" And without blinking an eye, she looks at him and says, "Then Bob would be the governor of Indiana today." And so I just want you to know that without the business community, we wouldn't be where we are. So we thank you for the great work that you do. And I also want to say this morning that, there are really certain times in a nation's history where the decisions we make are so pivotal that they not only chart the future of that nation, but literally write the future of the world. And sometimes you don't realize you're living in those moments, but historians can identify them when they look back in a chronological picture of events and can put their finger on when that particular decision-making process took place and how it charted a different future. But then there are other moments when it's absolutely clear that our actions are molding the future in such a fundamental way that we find ourselves straining unusually hard to get a glimpse of the shape it will take. And I believe you and I are in one of those latter moments right now. We know that the pivotal questions we're making are going to shape the future, not just for the United States, but for the world. And all across this country and across the world, people are really gleaning to see if they can just get just a glimpse of what that future is going to look like. One of the things that bothers me is the fact that as I travel across the country today, the major question that people are posing to me is one that I've never heard before in my career or really in my life, and it is this: is the future of America optimistic or is it pessimistic? And I can tell you I've had ambassadors come into my office, they ask that question. My suspicion is that there's not a person in this room that hasn't at least thought that question if you haven't verbalized it. And I want to begin this morning with two things. First is my feeling that I think it is optimistic, and it's not just puff that I bring to you, but I truly believe that whenever Americans are faced with whatever challenge they face, if we can bring our brains and our heart together, we can solve that challenge. But I want to offer one caveat to you, and it's one that Dan alluded to when he was kind enough to give me that introduction. It is hard to see how that there is any calculus that creates an optimistic future for this country without a strong national defense. The defense minister for China made a statement that I think was insightful in December of last year. He said for China to reach their destiny, they have to have a strong economy and they have to have a strong national defense. I believe with every ounce of my fiber as I stand here that for America to reach its destiny, whatever that destiny may be charted to be, we've got to have a strong economy and a strong national defense. But you begin to unravel one and you begin to unravel the other. And I wanted to take just a moment today because it's what Barry had asked me to address and some of the impacts of the cuts that we're going to have and what that may do to Virginia. But I want to begin by saying that before anything happened with the super committee, we had already taken $485 billion of cuts to national defense. And look, numbers go over our heads. All of us, statistics, numbers, we live with them every day, but when you hear them, they just become so big we don't pay attention to it. Those cuts alone were transformational in nature. And with the super committee failing to reach any kind of solution, we will now more than double those cuts that had already been taken. And that was not on the planning scope for anybody in the Pentagon. They would look at those cuts and say, you can't be serious. There's no way that we can possibly do those. But here's the world we live in today. And I want to do two things. First of all, I want to take off the table. I don't want to come in here today and tell you how we got here. I could go to another forum another time and we could argue about that, we could debate about that, we could talk about it. People smarter than me could come in here and tell you, I'm going to point the finger at Dan, I'm going to point the finger at Barry, point the finger at somebody else and say that's how we got here. Another day, another time. Second thing is I don't want to even tell you the solution of how we get out of it. Another debate, another time, another place. Some people say raise taxes, others reduce spending, change spending, prioritize, whatever. Don't want to do that today. What I want to do is give you a snapshot of where your world is because that's what you have to make business decisions about. And the reality is we had $485 billion of cuts. You'll hear different figures, and the reason is because nobody, including the Secretary of Defense, knows exactly what they are, and we just kind of agree it's going to be a ballpark 465 to 485. And then that's going to be more than doubled by super committee action, and here's the key ingredients. The President has said, have to take him at his word, that he will veto any legislation that changes the triggers on those defense cuts. The Majority Leader has said that he will not bring up any legislation that changes the trigger on those defense cuts. And there's a group of people in the House who believe, oh, you can just fix it after the next election and that's okay. But you can't fix it after the next election because these budgets will actually be poured into concrete and you'll have programmatic cuts, you'll have things that will take place because the Department of Defense is budgeting for 5-year programmatic situations. So with that world in mind, let me just give you a snapshot from a strategic point of view, and then I'm going to talk about the economics of it. The Navy right now, for the first time in many of our lifetimes, is facing a situation. We pick up our headlines and we look at Iraq and we look at Afghanistan. Let me just tell you, the headlines tomorrow is not going to be Afghanistan and Iraq. It's going to be China. It's going to be Pakistan, which is arguably the most dangerous country in the world today. It's going to be Iran. If they get a nuclear weapon, you will see it every day in there. Or it's going to be perhaps Turkey or North Korea that you're going to be looking at. If you take that snapshot today, we are living in a world for the first time in many of our lifetimes. In fact, I would suggest everybody's lifetime. When the Chinese have more ships in their Navy than we have in our Navy, and their building curve is going up and our building curve is going down. For the first time that we live in a world, and this is what Robert Kaplan said just recently in an article he wrote, and I'm going to quote him just because I can't articulate it any better. He says there's a big difference between a 346-ship U.S. Navy and a 250-ship Navy the difference between one kind of world order and another. For the first time, the Chinese outstick us. That means basically if you look at two of our ships lined up beside each other, their missiles can hit us at 185 kilometers. We can't hit them unless we get within 120 kilometers because we haven't modernized any of our surface missiles in the last decade. For the first time, in 8 years from now, just 8 years, by the end of this decade, they will outnumber us in subs 78 to 32 in the Pacific arena. And we have a $367 million shortfall in just the maintenance on our Navy ships and our Navy vessels. And that's the snapshot of where we are today. Just a quick snapshot. Now then I want you to look at the Marines. The Marines will tell us if these cuts... Now also I want to tell you this. Why is that important? Some people say, I don't care about the Pacific. We better care. It's $1 trillion of trade that goes through there every year. And in addition to that, 90% of the world economy goes by oceans. Do we really want a situation where our Navy has to get permission from anybody else in the world for our ships to go anywhere? And then the Marines will tell you if these cuts come through, from a strategic point of view, they'll be down to 145 to 150,000 men in their force structure. Now, what does that mean? It means General Dunford, Vice Chief of the Marines, will tell you they can't win one contingency anywhere in the world. We used to have a strategy. We'd win two wars at one time. Then we reduced that down and said, let's win one and hold one till we can get to the other one. Now our strategy will be we won't be able to win a single contingency. That means invasion in Taiwan, North Korea, to South Korea, or Israel. We can't win that contingency. Now, many people then say, well, we don't want to be in those fights. We don't want to be in those fights. But the greatest flashing lights that would be given a green light to have one of those conflicts is to have a vacuum where we couldn't be there, and we couldn't stop that. The other thing that I think it's important for us to remember is that the Air Force has always had air superiority. Every battle we've had since the Korean War, we haven't had a single soldier, sailor, or Marine that's been killed by a foreign aircraft since the Korean War. General Breedlove will tell you, these cuts come in, all of that air superiority will be threatened. And many of us recognize the Chinese are developing their new stealth bomber. Secretary Gates, when he was secretary, told us they wouldn't have that until 2020. They politely flew it when he was over there visiting to let them know that they had it a little sooner. And what are we doing? We are cutting out our F-22, and I will tell you with these cuts, even the F-35 could be looking at a very difficult time. And to the Army, they will tell you the force structure is going to be enormously small and reduce modernization. Now, let me come back and forget for just a moment the strategic concerns of that, which worries me every day. And let me just tell you why it's important to you for the economic impacts that's going to take place. Many of you remember that just a little over a year ago, the Joint Forces Command in Hampton Roads was shut down. It was shut down with no pre-decisional analysis. First time we hadn't had a strategic review and said, let's do the decision at the beginning. We just said, we need $100 billion. Where do we get it? Here's the best place to get it. We were told at those press conferences that day, if you remember, any of you watch and you can see, we're going to reprogram this money and put it back into services. We came out and said, it's not going to happen, never going to happen, that money's going to be gone. Within 4 months, that money was gone, and it paled in comparison to the dollars that we now see that's going to be cut. Before any of these cuts, this is before these cuts, the administration had made a decision, as many of you know, to move land-based missiles out of Europe and put them on our Aegis ships. And many of us said, how does that impact me? I don't care if the land-based missiles are in Poland and the Czech Republic. Well, first of all, that was the best system to have. But let me tell you economically where it hits all of us. That means the Navy was given no additional assets for those missile defense systems. So they had to use the Aegis destroyers that they had. That means we're now going to home port 4 of those destroyers in Spain, and probably 3 of those destroyers will come out of Norfolk. Could be all 4 of them. We just don't know that answer yet. Each of those destroyers, 300 men on them, men and women on them, but you can extrapolate from that with their families, about 1,000 people, and then all the support groups from that, they're going to be shifted out. Already, we've seen in the defense authorization bill that's coming over from the Senate, we can't stop it. Senator Nelson from Florida is trying to push to get additional destroyers moved down to Mayport, because Mayport in about 3 more years is going to become a ghost town in terms of the work that they're doing down there. You say, how does that impact us? Where do you think those destroyers are going to come from? 4 destroyers more that'll be coming, 4 to 6 out of Norfolk. Again, about 300 people with their families, about 1,000 people, all the supply groups. If you get 10 destroyers, 6 to Mayport, 3 to 4 to Spain, that's almost half of the fleet we have in Norfolk right now of destroyers, which is 22 at that particular point in time. All of you have known and you've seen in the paper talking about Mayport and trying to get a carrier down to Florida. The economic impact of that, 3,000 men and women living in Hampton Roads. You multiply that by their families and you're looking at almost 10,000 people. And each availability to work on that, 700 people. And you're pulling those probably from Norfolk to send down to Mayport, some of whom will just say, I'm going to go ahead and live down there if that happens. Now that's before the cuts. Now with the cuts, we've got right now 40,360 active duty people that are living in the Commonwealth of Virginia. The Armed Services Committee is projecting these cuts will mean about 5,246 of them will lose their jobs. Job losses in Virginia, these cuts go through 122,800 jobs lost in Virginia. Gross state product reduction could be $10.5 billion. And for every dollar of decrease that we see in DoD equipment purchases, it'll equal $2.64 of lost sales elsewhere in the Commonwealth. Now, in addition to that, though, Secretary Panetta has projected this. And this is Secretary Panetta, his projections, a 1% increase in unemployment from just the defense cuts that will take place. If you have a 1% increase, that's about 1.53 million jobs that he's projecting could take place. And let me put a face on this. I just got back from giving a speech at a tech group in Florida. Orlando was the hardest, not Orlando, but Florida was the hardest hit state in construction losses during the recession. About a third of them were in Orlando, and not in Orlando, but in Central Florida. The projections are, if these cuts come through, that the job losses that will entail from that will be greater than all of the construction job losses that took place during the recession. And Virginia, Texas, and California will get the hardest on those. But let's assume this. Let's assume that Secretary Panetta was wrong. Let's say he has overstated his case. And you pick the number. He did it by 50%. Let's say he overstated it by 2/3. Even if it's 1/3 of the number Secretary Panetta is projecting, it would equal all of the unemployed people in West Virginia, New Mexico, Maine, Nebraska, Montana, Hawaii, New Hampshire, Delaware, Alaska, South Dakota, Vermont, Wyoming, and North Dakota combined. That's what we're looking at with the economic hits that could be coming our way if they come through. Now, let me step back and tell you the last couple things. There are 4 questions that we've got to ask for national defense in this country. It's not rocket science. It's just basic questions that we have to ask. The first one is this. What's the true threat assessment to the United States, both short-term and in the near future? The second one is, what do our combatant commanders need to perform the missions necessary to protect us against those threats? Third, how do we get those resources to them in the most efficient means possible? And the fourth one is, what do we want to pay for national defense? What do we feel we can afford to pay? But an equal corollary is this. What is the risk to the United States of America if we do not supply those resources? And I'm just going to suggest to you that over the last year, the only question you have heard in this town, no matter leadership of either party, from White House, from Congress, has been, what do we want to pay? How much can we afford? No one has been asking the corollary question, which is, what is the risk to the United States of America if we don't supply those resources? Now, when they do come before our hearings, and when we ask them that question, what's the risk? You will always hear this term. It is an acceptable risk. What in the world does acceptable risk mean? It's kind of like when you go in the restaurant and you look at the waiter and say, what do you like to eat? The key is, for acceptable risk, I then always ask the second question, risk to what? And then we hear this question, or this statement. It is a risk to the mission or a risk to the institution. And the reason for that is it makes us desensitized to what's actually happening. But if you bring in this room anybody in a military uniform and you ask them the risk, you know what they'll tell you acceptable, or the risk is? It is the number of people that come back home when we have a mission. And we will hear somebody say this: we're going to change our strategy so we don't have to do all these things. Ike Skelton was the former chairman of the Armed Services Committee. We had a hearing just a few weeks ago. Ike was brought back. Senator John Warner, who many of you remember, had great expertise, and Senate Armed Service Chairman, and Duncan Hunter, former chairman. I asked each of the three of them if you could give us any advice, one bit of warning that we could share with other members of Congress and with this committee, what would it be? And Ike said this. He said, since I was in Congress, we had 13 different contingencies. He said 12 of them were unexpected, and we couldn't predict them. Only one of them was expected. Anytime a sailor, anytime a soldier, Marine, or an airman is asked by the President of the United States to go do a mission, he's not going to say, no, we can't do it because it wasn't in our strategic plan. He's going to salute and say, we go. The question about risk is how many of his men and women come back home after they've done that mission. And let me just close with this. I think two things as far as where we are today is important. One of them is just my recommendation of something that you can all do that would make a huge difference. And that is this. I say this as respectfully as I can. You do a lot of wonderful things. We do a lot of great things in Virginia. I've spoken to Barry about this. I recommend very strongly that we create in Virginia a statewide commission, task force, Barry, whatever it might be, that is focused on looking at national defense issues and the economic impact of those issues to Virginia, and how we can fight to make sure we're fighting in Virginia to hold them. Because I can tell you, Florida's doing that every single day, and we need to be in that fight. And so I just wholeheartedly recommend that you consider doing that. It shouldn't be one that's just for show. It should be one where you roll up your sleeves and pull the political people together, the business people together, and say, what are we going to do to make sure that we maintain much of the military spending that we can that's important to our national defense in Virginia. The second thing I want to leave you with is this. I started by saying I was optimistic. I'm going to conclude by saying I'm optimistic. I just got back from Israel and looking at their missile defense systems because of the situation with Iran after we had that report that they had everything they needed to develop a nuclear weapon. And you know, day after day, the Israelis live with a catastrophic forecast over their head, and they come to the table with their brains and their heart, and they find a way to get out of it. Americans have always been able to do the same thing, and I think we will do it today. The other thing, though, that I want to tell you is this. A few years back, I began looking because I'd go across the country and everybody was getting bad news. You know, you know how it is. You turn on your TV, it's bad news. You plug into the internet, it's bad news. Pick up a newspaper, it's bad news. I'd tell my staff, please give me some good news. Even if you're lying to me, just give me some good news. And I realized this, though. I looked at hunting situations, and I found that the greatest hunters in the world were lions. And I realized that the male lion will always go to the front of the grassland. He's too proud to crouch, so he sits, and he just sits and he waits. And he takes all of that power and he holds it in. The true hunters are the lionesses. It's normally 9 to 12 of them in a pride, and they work their way to the back of the grassland, and they do it in a very stealthy fashion. But when they're in position and they're ready, that male lion senses it, and he begins to roar, and you can hear that roar for 6 to 8 miles. It feels like the ground is shaking. And the animals always do one of two things, very predictable. They either become paralyzed with fear, and when they do, those lionesses move in like an invisible net and destroy them, or they turn and run from that roar right into the clutches of those lionesses that devour. If only they had the strength and the wisdom and the character and the courage to run towards that roar, they would run right past that male lion. He could never get them. If ever there was a time in America's history that we can't afford to become paralyzed with fear, that we can't run from that roar, it's today. But I'm absolutely convinced if we'll have the character and the strength and the faith and the courage to run towards the roars that we hear, we'll do what generations of Americans have done before us, and that is we'll defend and protect freedom for our children and our grandchildren. Thank you so much for letting me be with you.